should be, takes a minute and we can get started. All right. Oh, admit. A few more people trickling in. Okay. Just make sure this is off. Okay, good. We're good on that. All right, awesome. So actually it's 6 o'clock now. So I'll get started. I'm just gonna go over a couple of details really quick first. So for the participants that are in the Zoom call, I'm just gonna keep you all muted. If you could stay muted throughout the session, just so this pretty much all goes smoothly, that'd be great, except for our speakers. And then for Facebook Live, oh, I'm sorry, before that, people who are in Zoom, if you have any questions for either of the speakers, please put them in the comment section right below us, and then we'll ask them at the end of the presentation. People who are on our Facebook Live, hello. If you can post your comments in the comment section below, I'll be able to ask the people that are speaking at the end. So we're going to leave Q&A for the end of the lecture from both JoLynne and Ron. So without any more details there, I'll just jump right into it. So welcome to our third exhibition exchange. I'm Adriana Dunn, the museum curator at the West Tennessee Delta Heritage Center. During this exhibition exchange, Ron Brister and JoLynne Minnick will talk about archaeology of West Tennessee and the artifacts featured and those who came before exhibition. This exhibition was organized by the museum's curatorial intern, JoLynne Minnick. The sherds and intact pottery, projectile points, and stone tools demonstrate the evolution of material culture in West Tennessee through the centuries of habitation that will be shown, and a small view of the lives of the indigenous people will be brought to life. The objects in the exhibition are on loan from the C.H. Nash Museum at Chucalissa and from the collection of Ron Brister. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers. Ron Brister retired as collections manager for the Pink Palace family of museums after 37 years of service. He continues to volunteer his expertise through the Mid-South, is president of the Friends of Chucalissa, and librarian for the Memphis Archaeological and Geological Society. JoLynne Minnick is a current graduate student from the University of Memphis working towards a master's in art history with a concentration in Egyptian art and archaeology and a museum certificate. She has organized the Archaeology of West Tennessee exhibit as a part of her curatorial internship with the WTDHC. So I'm going to go ahead and hand you guys the virtual microphone and let y'all get started, but welcome to both of our speakers.
Thank you.
Would you like to start?
Oh, do you want me to start or do you want you to start?
Okay.
I can't hear you.
Ron,
sorry.
if you can either turn up your mic maybe or speak a little bit louder. It's a little tiny hard to hear from you.
Oh, okay.
That's better.
Okay. Hi, my name is Ron Brister. I've been working in the Archaeology of West Tennessee, northern Mississippi, and eastern Arkansas for the past 50 years. One of the things that has fascinated me so much about it is the change that this area has gone through. We think the first people came here around 12,000 years ago or longer. That's a long, long time. Now, the problem with that is that, first of all, we think they were nomads. They were following herds of animals, and therefore they didn't have a lot of stuff. You can't carry a lot of stuff when you're walking and following the herds. And so their remains are very sparse and hard to find. The second thing is that many archaeological specimens that we find are not really representative of all the things that the people use. In this warm, wet climate of southeastern U.S., items such as leather, textiles and basketry, furs, none of those things are preserved. And even wood objects. We know that they made a lot of stuff out of wood, but we very rarely find any wooden remains on the site. And so we're looking at things that happened a long time ago, and the record is not preserved very well. But we can still tell a lot about the folks who lived here. First of all, as I said earlier, this has been an area of great change. Starting about 12,000 years ago, the glaciers began to recede. Originally, they were to the north of us, up in Illinois, and the climate warmed up when the glaciers receded to the north. This released a tremendous amount of water from the
Hey,
glaciers.
Ron, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. There's a little trouble still hearing you. Is it maybe possible to move the mic closer, or I'm so sorry.
Oh, okay. Is this any better at all? I don't even know where the microphone is in this thing.
Do you have something maybe blocking it, or is it just,
I don't think so.
huh? There's a little bit of background noise to it. I'm so, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. Well, I'll try to speak up.
Okay, that's better. Thank you.
Okay. Even the vegetation here was different 12,000 years ago. We had blue spruce trees that were growing down in the valleys. Now, these spruces are not found anywhere closer than Michigan now. So that's how much the climate has changed. It's warmed up quite a bit. We also have had a lot of changes in the landforms in the area. As the sea levels went up and down during the periods of glaciation, the streams in this area tended to entrench and then overflow. And so we would have terraces built up in the river valleys and then eroded away. And again, that would cause us to lose a lot of our archaeological evidence. And so we're dealing with some real problems, and yet we still have a lot of good material out there to study. So we're still not doing well on the volume. Can you hear volume okay? Okay, I can't hear you now.
Oh, we're okay. Yep, you're doing fine.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. So with those two problems, the immense length of time that we're dealing with, and the fragility of the artifacts that are left behind, and the scarcity of artifacts, we have to make use of every bit of information we can get on the people that lived in this area. One thing that we can do is to study the human remains that we occasionally find. This allows us to tell the age of the person at death. We can tell the sex of the individual, the height, and the race. And this is all very interesting to us in developing the demography. We can tell how many people would be in the group, about how long each age group would live. A lot of times the really young children would die off early because they didn't have the modern medicine that we enjoy. And then the young men, middle-aged, and the young women would die off a lot because the women were giving birth to children without medical aid. And then the young men were engaged in warfare and hunting, both of which are very dangerous. Now we can tell the height and the general nutrition of the people that lived in this area. We know that they ate pretty well. They were hunters and gatherers. They hunted probably mostly white-tailed deer. The deer tend to travel in groups, and the Indians used a weapon called an atlatl. An atlatl is a spear thrower. It's a short stick that you could hook onto a dart or a spear, and you can throw the spear much harder than you can just by using your arms. And we think the Indians probably hunted in small groups of 3 or 4 men, and they would surround the game trail, and when the animals came down, they would throw their darts, and hopefully someone would get a hit. They would field dress the animal so they didn't have to carry all of the weight out into the field, and then take the good food parts back to the camp. They didn't live in permanent villages in the earliest times. They were always moving around. The shelters were probably just piles of brush to keep the wind off. So they had fires to keep warm during the winter and to cook. We can tell a lot about what they were hunting by the bones of the animals that are found in the sites. And these changed through time. Now the women were very busy. They were gatherers. They would go out, and this of course was in addition to taking care of the children, but they would go out and they would gather tubers and berries and fruits, even barks and leaves that were edible. and they would make these things into foodstuffs. The women also took care of the children. I can imagine that took quite a bit of time. But the good thing was the children would learn from their parents. The young boys would learn to use an ladle from an early age and were probably awfully good at it by the time they were teenagers. And then the girls learned all the good plants that they could gather and how to prepare them into nutritious food. As time went on, the Indians began to modify their ways of life. They began to live in semi-permanent camps. They would set up a camp and live there during the season. Let's say that the hickory trees produce nuts in a certain season in the fall. The Indians knew where the hickory trees were, and they would move there so they could harvest the hickory nuts. They would grind these up, boil them, and oil would float to the top of the bowl that the hickory nuts were boiled in. And that was really good cooking oil. That gave a good source for cooking the food that they needed. Deer don't have much oil in them. They don't have much grease. And so the Indians had to be very careful to supplement their oil by using the deer and the hickory nuts. The camps eventually evolved into semi-permanent camps where the Indians would find really good places to gather and hunt, and they may move only twice a year, and then eventually they began to use agriculture to produce plant foods that they could eat. They began with plants that we think of as weeds today, goosefoot, chenopodium, things like that. And these produce small, oily, and starchy foods. These seeds could be ground up and eaten and provide a good nutritious meal. As time went on, the Indians adapted into a more permanent lifestyle in villages. And around 2000 BC, they began to make mounds. Now, we all think of the Indian mounds as being a feature of our early Indians in this area. The original mounds were dome-shaped, and these were generally made for burials. An important person in the group would die. There would be big ceremonies held. The body would be buried in a wooden crypt and then covered with a mound of earth. And then later, other people could be buried in that mound on top of the original important man's tomb. Later, around 800 AD, the Indians began to make flat-top temple mounds. These are like the ones you see at Chucalissa. These things were large, flat building structures. They were built only to house structures, not really for burial mounds. Usually there would be two buildings in this area. There would be a chief's house. The chief was also the chief priest, and there would be a temple building. And the temple building would contain the skeletal remains of ancestors. The Indians would bury an ancestor when he died and then dig the bones up later, a couple of years later, clean them real well and place them in baskets in the temple. And there they were venerated by the people. Ancestor worship is very important. Remember, the earlier houses were made of piles of brush, but later on, again around 600 AD up to 800 AD, they began making a more permanent house. Wooden posts were stuck in the soil. The walls were covered with cane or brush, and then they were covered with a layer of mud. This layer of mud dried and was protected by a thick grass roof on the building. And the grass made the house waterproof, but also kept it cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. We know that in the later period, say after 800 AD, that the Indians had a stratified society. There were people who were more important than others. You remember around 2000 BC, they began to bury more important people into the burial mounds. Well, by 800 AD, in what we call the Mississippian period, we were getting chieftains set up. And these chieftains had hereditary leadership. That is, if your daddy was a chief, you were the chief. They had a warrior class, and they had a noble class, and then they had the common people class. The leadership was provided by the chief and the nobles. They would hold meetings in the temple building to decide important things like warfare and who they would be at peace with, and when to plant the crops, things like that. The fire was considered sacred in the temple building, and it was kept burning all year long, except at the beginning of the corn harvest season. And at that time, the fire was extinguished, there were ceremonies, and then the fire was relit. The Indians had very complex religious ideas, although they didn't have language, didn't have writing like we do. We know that they did have very complex thoughts in this stuff. They believed in a sun god. They believed that the ancestors could intercede for them to change events, and they went through many elaborate ceremonies to keep the sun god and the ancestors happy. Now, some of the crafts that the Indians practiced in order to live well were things like leatherworking. They would kill a deer, take the skin off of the deer, the hide, and then they would scrape the flesh and the blood and the fat off of it, and then they would boil it in a soup made out of the brains of the animal. And this would tan the skin. It would keep it from rotting. And to make the skin as flexible as possible, they would chew on it. And many times when you look at the teeth of the earlier people, they're worn down almost to the gums from where they would chew on the skins to make them soft. We knew that they did a lot of woodworking. In the Mid-South, we don't have bridges. We don't have a lot of roads at that time. And so the Indians would travel mostly by canoe. They used dugout canoes, and they were made by cutting down a big cypress tree and hauling it out and using it as a dugout canoe. Some of these things are huge and could carry dozens of people. There were also trails. The Indians would follow the trails that were made by the animals, like deer, but they made their own trails too sometimes. The Indians traded with their neighbors a lot. We find that copper from Michigan, galena, which is found up in southern Illinois, quartz crystals, which are found over in Arkansas near Hot Springs now, and hard igneous rocks were traded in from the Appalachian Mountains. And these were made into decorations and tools by the Indians. Even the arrowheads, spear points, and the knives that they made were made out of stone. They were chipped out of stone. The smaller ones could be made out of gravel rock, which is so prominent in the rivers here. But then the bigger artifacts, the axes and adzes and things like that, could be made out of very hard rock that was imported from what is now Alabama. The Indians also traded ideas. They traded ideas about religion. The sun god worship probably came up to this area from the southwestern U.S. along with corn agriculture. The Indians were remarkable agriculturalists. They could, using primitive techniques by our standards, which included slash and burn agriculture, they would go in, kill trees in an area, burn them down, and then plant their crops in the open fields. And these fields would be fertile for 5 years or so until the corn crops and the beans and the peas would take all of the nutrients out of the soil, and they had to move to another area and do that again. And when they abandoned the field, a lot of times it was called an old field. And if you look at maps in Mississippi and Arkansas, sometimes you'll see places named Tunica Old Fields. And these were originally Indian agricultural sites. The Indians wore clothes. The men wore loincloth, and the women wore a skirt, but no top. These things were made out of fabric. They would go to trees like mulberry trees, strip the outer bark off, and then strip the fine inner bark and make thread out of the inner bark, and then they would weave that. When the Spanish came through this area in 1541, they remarked that the cloth that the Indians made was as fine as some of the best cloth you could get in Europe. So these Indians were quite skilled artisans. The women made pottery. They took local clays and mixed it with materials like ground up pottery or stone to keep the pot from breaking when it was fired. And then they fired it in a fireplace and a fire pit and made the pot very, very hot. They decorated these pots with religious symbols and probably used them for storing food and for cooking and for serving food. The most common shapes were bowls and jars and plates. Water was gotten from local springs or rivers or lakes. Lakes provided a lot of the food that the Indians ate too, particularly in the later period. When we dig at sites like Chucalissa, we found a lot of fish bones and turtle bones. These were all gutted and thrown into the pot and made into a soup and served for very good, nutritious meals. We talked a little bit about the weapons. The tools that the Indians used was hunting, but some of the other weapons they used, of course, the idol that we talked about earlier, which is a throwing stick with a dart, and they also used war clubs. Now, the Indians' idea of war was quite different. When we have war today, it's called total war. You go out and you just kill everything. But the Indians would do little raids. They didn't intend to go out and completely wipe out their enemy. But they would have these revenge raids. Someone would raid you, and then you would raid their village. There was one burial found at Chucalissa of an adult man, and he was buried with 3 trophy skulls. These were apparently cut off of the bodies of people he had killed in raids and were buried with him as an honor. Let's see. We talked about the Spanish that came through in 1541. Of course, that was a big shock to the Indians because they probably had no idea that there were many other people in the world besides themselves. They didn't travel around like we did. They couldn't fly to Paris or China. And so their knowledge of the world was pretty limited. DeSoto came in, and I think some of the worst things that he did, or some of the most important things he did, were to reshape alliances between the Indians. Because in the later period, around 1400 AD, the Indians were joining into provinces, and there would be 4 or 5 villages inside a political province, and then there would be a big town, the primary town, and then there would be a paramount chief who was the head of the whole province. And then maybe 6 or 8 of these provinces were named. And they would shift alliances. One time they would be together, other times they'd be fighting each other. A lot of this fighting was over agricultural land because the agricultural techniques were so poor that they had to keep shifting their farm fields, and they also could use only the most fertile soil. We do find evidence of warfare. For instance, at Chucalissa, we find the forearms of men, often now what we call prairie blades, which is where they would hold their arm up to defend themselves from the war club or tomahawk, and their arm would be hit with it, and it would break their arm. And so you find fractures in the bone there. We also find people that have arrowheads shot into the bodies. Of course, at that time, they didn't have modern medicine, and if you were shot with an arrowhead, it would be pretty much luck if you survived. They had no way of fighting the infection, no way of doing surgery, like relieving the pain. And so, were there any, did y'all have any questions about what we talked about so far? Anything you'd like to discuss more?
I'm just going to talk about the exhibition. So anything else you feel we would like to talk about is fine with me.
Okay. Like I said, the Indians didn't have writing, so we're having to guess about a lot of stuff they did. We don't know the names of the tribes. For instance, we know the names of provinces that were here 500 years ago. And the Spanish came through, but we don't know what the Indians called themselves. We don't know what language they spoke. And even more importantly, we know that between 1500 and 500 years ago, and the Europeans first crossed settlers into this area, about 700 AD, a lot of the Indians here have disappeared. We think that the Indian population was reduced by epidemic diseases, things like measles and smallpox. And so these things would have come into England would have had no immunity to them, and it would have wiped them out. Probably up to 90% of the population could have been killed. And we think that a lot of the limits of these tribes drifted south to what is now southern Arkansas, Louisiana. Let's see. We talked a little about the art. A lot of the art is reflected on the pottery that the Indians made. We find that they use symbols like the symbol for the sun, which was a squirrel. They had rattlesnakes, turtles, fish, things like that, deer. Some of these reflected their idea of what the world was like, what the cosmos was like. The Indians felt that there were three levels of existence. There was this level, this world, where we live in, we're all familiar with that. And then there was an upper world where everything was in order and was clean and neat and went very well. And then there was a lower world that was chaos. And so they wanted to avoid the chaos as much as possible. And so we believe that they were associating some animals with the lower world. For instance, animals that live in the water were considered to be part of the lower world. Pigs would be. Snakes would be part of the lower world because they live in burrows. Whereas animals like deer and raccoons and possums would be part of this world. And then animals that flee, like birds, would be part of the upper world. And the Indians were apparently quite fascinated by the animals that span two of the worlds. For instance, a turtle can live in the water and live on the land. So that was a really interesting application. A bat looked like a mammal that would live on the land, but it flies through the air. And ducks fly through the air, they walk on the land, and they swim in the water. So these were all fascinating animals to them, and these were incorporated in some of the art motifs that they were using in the topic. I think that's about it, really, unless I have questions. Did you have anything you want to ask?
I think we can turn it over to JoLynne then. JoLynne, if you want to start on your presentation whenever you're ready.
Of course, let me make sure the screen shares correctly. I've only done this once before. Okay. Okay, is everybody able to see that? Hopefully.
You're good to go.
Okay, awesome. Like Adriana said earlier, my exhibition that I created is called Those Who Came Before, Archaeology and Material Culture of the Ancient People of West Tennessee. I was slightly nervous but very excited to take on this endeavor because all of my archaeological experience is on the other side of the world where everything's very, very different. And so this was a very fun endeavor for me. How do I make it go? Okay. So this is actually a map that I found very early on in just my perusal of trying to learn just what type of archaeology is happening in Tennessee. This is a map from 1923, starting in the 20th and into the starting in the 19th and the 20th century. After this land was purchased by the United States, as people began to move west, different surveyors were coming through, tracking where Native American settlements were, where they would find mounds that were no longer inhabited, and then the trails of how people would move around and where the trade was coming from. So this was one of the first images I found. It was very daunting for me because it seems like a lot, but thankfully I only had to work with West Tennessee. And so just to give another overview, Ron talked about this, but the four main archaeological periods that I worked with for my exhibit are the Paleo-Indian, which most archaeologists I'm finding go all the way back to 20,000 BCE. But like Ron said, a lot of what we have doesn't start showing up until about 12,000, and it goes to roughly 8,000. And this is a strictly hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and they would live in small family groups that would follow the big game. And then you have the Archaic period, which is usually divided into 3 areas or 3 sub-periods. The early, which is 8,000 to 6,000. The middle one, which mostly people say is around 5,500. And then the late period, which is 3,000 to 1,000 BCE. And the interesting thing about the Archaic period is that while they are still doing a hunter-gathering lifestyle, some forms of horticulture start emerging, but it's not actually until the late Archaic period that we actually start getting pottery that survives. And one of the issues with these earlier periods is that since so much time has passed since these people lived, it's hard to have things that survive, but also with the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, they're just not carrying a ton of stuff. And then you come into the woodland period, which is where you really start seeing more sedentary life where people stay and they actually have agriculture. And this is from 1000 BCE to 900 CE. And then you have the Mississippian period, which is 900 to roughly 1600. So it's just right before we start getting a lot of Europeans coming to the continent. And the late period starts at about 1450, and that's really where a lot of the stuff that I actually was able to find for my exhibition come from. And then, of course, you get into the later periods where you have Europeans coming in, and then eventually the land is purchased by the United States. So this is a map I made of West Tennessee because when I first started doing my research, after I figured out the different periods, I wanted to try to find which sites in West Tennessee were attributed to which. So we have the Carson Con-Short site, which is in Benton County, the Pierce site, which is in Chester County, and those are both Paleo-Indian sites. And then the Ava site, which is also in Benton County, is an Archaic site. And up in Benton County and Henry County, I found that a lot of the earlier sites, they were first excavated strictly because they wanted to build a dam on the river. And once they built that dam and the reservoir was put in, all of these sites are now underwater. So they came in the 1930s and the 1940s, did all their excavating, got as much as they could, and then the government built the dam, and then everything went underwater. And then Pison Mound is in Madison County, and that actually is a park that you can go and visit. It is one of the biggest woodland sites that I was able to find, and the Johnson site is actually just a couple miles away. But it was actually found later than Pison Mounds by surveyors and who came through strictly because Pison Mounds is so big that they just overlooked the Johnson site until later. And then finally we have the Mississippian, which of course is Chucalissa over here in Memphis, Obion Mounds and Swallow Bluff Island Mounds, and then Graves Lake. And one of the things that I really found doing my research was that everything in the Mississippian period, there's so much more of it. There's a population increase, and since it's so late in the chronology, a lot of the stuff still survives. So this is the C.H. Nash Museum at Chucalissa. It is where I got a lot of my artifacts from the Mississippian period, and then all my other stuff is actually from Ron. And they were so kind to give me the Oswalt collection that they had. I was able to go to the museum, handle the objects, and then pick which ones I wanted. And some of the objects that are actually on display in my exhibition this is actually their first time being seen by the public. So if you should really go see it. It's really great. So now I just want to go through some of the objects that I have in my exhibition and just talk a little bit more about what they are. So we're going to start with the Paleo-Indian period since it's the earliest. And these are two dart heads that Ron loaned me for this exhibition. These are fascinating. I have never really dealt with these sort of objects. But what I realized very early on is that as I was doing my research, there is a lot of technical jargon that people use when discussing arrowheads that just goes right over my head. But these two I have attributed to being Clovis type. As far as I can tell, I was able to find a database that has all of the known arrowhead, darthead points in Tennessee. And so by spending hours looking at this database, I think these are actually Clovis points. And it's just, it's really interesting to see when you go and see it, the chisel marks that's in the stone, where you can physically see how they crafted these. And then we move to the Archaic period, which again, I do not have a lot of objects for, but one of the ones that I was able to get is this soapstone fragment. Like I said, it isn't until the late Archaic period that we actually start getting pottery. And soapstone vessels are actually the most common form of pottery at this time. And it was usually, the stone was usually shaped into a shallow, flat bowl or plate. And it wasn't actually placed on the fire, but near the flames, because the soapstone is actually a very bad conductor of heat. And then also during the Archaic period, we have, again, projectile points. These ones are, the left is, I think, a Greenware type. And I was actually unable to identify anything that looked like the right one. And most of these projectile points are made of sherds at this time, which is a local rock in the area. So then we move to the woodland period. And this is when, like I said, we start getting agriculture. And sadly, I was not able to find any woodland projectile points or anything like that. But we do have pottery because pottery is now emerged, and there's actually a transition from soapstone to actual ceramics. With pottery, one of the fascinating things you can see in the transition from the woodland period to the Mississippian period is that they get more sophisticated than their decoration. So for the woodland pottery, on the left is the cord marking. So when the clay was still wet, they would press cords against it to give it some texture, and then it was fired. And then on the right is the fabric impressing, which is the same exact thing, but instead of using cords, they would use fabric. And that would give texture and decoration to the pots. So then we get to the Mississippian period, and by far this is my biggest section in my exhibition. And the map on the left that you see is a map that I found that shows all the different phases of Mississippian culture on either side of the Mississippi in this area. Chucalissa is right here, so it's part of the wall phase. And all of these phases share a lot of similar designs in pottery and in projectile points, but some decorations for pottery are more prevalent in other areas than in some phases. So my two of my stone tools that I have in my exhibition, on the right is an axe head that I was able to get from Chucalissa. And the divot that you see at the bottom of the picture is where the handle would have been placed on the axe. And then on the left is some form of scraper. It's a stone tool that is very, very smooth. And as you can see on the bottom, it is pointed slightly. So then we get to my projectile points. The one on the left and the one on the right are made of obsidian, which actually I discovered something very interesting in my research, in that there's no local obsidian in the area, and that they've done research and tests on the obsidian projectile points that they have found in Tennessee, and they're finding that a lot of the obsidian that these points are made of are actually from Nevada, California, Oregon, or even Arizona. So that shows that by this point there is trade from the west to the east, which is also obvious in other forms of material culture for these peoples. But it was really fascinating for me to find that the obsidian wasn't local. But the style of the projectile points, these small ones, the type and the style are local to the area. So then you come to question of whether the obsidian was brought uncarved from the west or not. And these, as you can see with that these projectile points are very small. And so you get varying sizes for these points depending on what type of game or that they are hunting. And then we come to my pottery decoration. By far, the Mississippian era has the most variety when it comes to decoration. And these are just a few of what is actually been found. On the top right, you have, it's called Parkin punctated, and they would use their fingernails on the wet clay to impress the design. And then the top left is engraved. And so after the pottery was fired, they would etch the design into the pottery. And in some cases, they would actually take a paste to give color to the lines so that they popped out a little more. And then finally on the bottom, we have incising, which is where they would etch the design into the wet clay before it was fired. And so I was very lucky to get from Chucalissa 4 pieces of intact pottery from the Mississippian era. These were in various states of pieces. When you go and look at them, you can see that they were actually reassembled before given to Chucalissa, which I am so thankful for whoever did that, because some of these just seem like a puzzle that I would not be able to actually put back together again. So first we have this Mississippian bowl. You can see that there are, at the bottom of the picture, there's blackening from burning, showing that it was used for cooking. And then there's also staining. And the rim is actually, the decoration is called exterior notching. And so they would do the notching around the outside of the rim just to add more decoration to the pottery. And if you look closely, and if you go to the museum and you actually can see these in person, you'll see little white specks all through the pottery for the Mississippian period. And during the late period of the Mississippian period, they started using shells to temper the clay. And so the white specks that you see are the actual shells that were worked into the clay. And there are 2 types of shell tempered pottery, according to archaeologists who work during this period. It is Mississippian plain pottery, which means that it's described as the shells being more coarse and so larger pieces, and then belle plain pottery, where the shell pieces are finer and so it's harder to see. Seems very subjective to me. I think there's an issue with that, just because who's to say how big the pottery pieces, the shell pieces are. I was also able to get an effigy bowl from Chucalissa, which he is probably my favorite piece. I call it a he, just because he has a face and a little tail. I actually have not been able to figure out exactly what he is. For effigies, they used anything from owls to snakes to turtles to mythological creatures that they believed in, but also priests and clowns. So I think he's either a priest or a clown. I have seen images of effigies that have what archaeologists are calling clowns, and the headdress that he is, or the top of him is slightly different. So I don't think he's a clown. I think he's probably a priest, but that's just my opinion. I just love him. And then I also got this jar without a neck. As you can see, the entire neck of the pottery is gone, which is really sad, but also with the huge holes that this piece has, you can actually see into the layers of the pottery. And as you can see, there's all of those white specks that again is showing the shell that they used to temper it. This poor piece of pottery, the hole in the front of it is 4 inches long and 2 inches wide. So it's a very, very significant piece that is missing. But even with the missing piece, I feel like this piece still shows so much about what we know about Mississippian pottery. And then my final one is actually a jar with a neck. This is my most, of the 2 jars, it's obviously the most intact. As you can see, there's a lot of cracks along it where it was reassembled, and we still have some missing pieces. But again, you can see the white shell temper, and with all of these pottery pieces, you can really see the wear and tear of the use. These aren't pristine pieces. They have chips on them, they have abrasions, and just general staining from use. So it really gives it a human feel, in my opinion, of that these are actual pieces that were constructed by human hands and were used and then eventually buried in the ground, and then for us to dig up later. So just as an ending, if you want to, I would come and see these in person. They are very fascinating, and I was not able to show all of the pieces that are actually on display. And so I highly encourage you to go see it if you can.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for sharing. I think we'll just dive into some questions then. I've got a really interesting question. So it says archaeological, and this is for both of you, if both of you want to jump in on it, but archaeological evidence seems to have begun to support an alternative view of woman the hunter rather than woman the gatherer. Most recently, remains were discovered in the Andes that add support to other evidence from around the Americas, suggesting that women may have been more active, or may have had a more active role in hunting than previously thought. Has this been an impact on the way we examine cultures of this area?
I did read that article, and I thought it was very interesting. The artifacts were very nice. It was a woman's skeleton, and she was buried with a hunting kit. It had various, it was an abalado with a dark hair. And then a kit of tools used to butcher animals, including choppers and scrapers. I don't know what it means. She may have been a hunter, or it may have been something that her husband put into her grave to help her get along in the next life. It's hard to tell. A lot of the assumptions that we make about the way that the Indians live, particularly the breakdown of responsibilities for hunting and gathering, are based on other cultures that were about the same technological grade as these people were. So we did have in the 16, 17, 1800s scientists who went out and studied people in Africa, in Asia, in South America, and even in parts of the United States. And they were able to record information on how people live. And so we use this so-called ethnographic analogy to help us understand what's going on. I think there were probably exceptions to everything that was going on. Even if women were not encouraged to hunt, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the women did. But again, everything is so iffy because the preservation is so bad. We don't, unfortunately, have a stone in there engraved huntress or gatherer. It's just you have to go back to things that are associated with the people in the grave. At Chucalissa, we found women burial associated with leatherworking tools. and also traffic working through. And so we do know that they were sometimes buried with these things.
Okay. All right. And did you want to add anything to that, JoLynne? Have you come across that at all with your research?
Not so much in my research for this exhibition. I do know of elsewhere in the world that these same sort of things are also happening, where they are finding burials of women who are buried with objects of war or hunting tools. And so who's to say no? That's my take.
Interesting. Next question was from JoLynne's exhibition. JoLynne, what did you mean by phases? Was that something with regards to historiography, or was that something related to geography? I think they mean on your map.
Oh, yes, the map. The phases are geographical.
Okay.
They separated different areas of either side of the Mississippi into just, as far as I'm aware, just groups and areas where they found certain pottery more prevalent than others. And so these are just our arbitrary ways of trying to categorize these areas.
Okay. Okay, cool. And I mean, one question, I love being the host of this, is I get to kind of take over and ask questions as I see fit. But out of all the collections, JoLynne, that you worked with, which object did you like the best, or were there a couple objects that you liked more than everything in there?
Oh, goodness. So like I said, I love the effigy bowl. I don't know why, I just love his little tail and his head. And the tail is actually had to be put back on. It was actually broken off, so you can see the little crack there on him. I also loved all of the projectile points, despite how long I had to stare at them to try to figure out what they were. It was a different type of research and investigation that I'm not used to, and just being able to look at them, try to figure out what they're made out of, trying to figure out what style they are. And every time I found one that I'm just like, I'm pretty sure it's this one, it was just so gratifying. So I love all the projectile points, especially the tiny little obsidian ones, because they're just so little and cute.
Yeah, definitely. And Ron, how long have you been collecting the private collection that you were so gracious to let us borrow? How long have you been collecting those objects?
Well, I actually didn't collect them myself. They were given to me.
Oh, okay.
People who came in and knew I was interested in artifacts. They gave them, and I so assembled it into the teaching collection. And most of the collection I gave to Chucalissa, but I did keep a few duplicate pieces, and that's what's in the collection.
Okay. Okay, cool. Very cool. All right. Well, I think that let me just double check with. Yep, there was a hello from North Carolina, which is so sweet. So thank you guys. I really appreciate that. And if you have any more final comments for everyone, other than everything that you've presented.
Well, I'm going to suggest that people take a look at their local archaeological areas. I know in Memphis we've got Chucalissa and the Chickasaw Heritage Park, which are two big mound sites. Over in Arkansas is the Parkin site, and in the town of Wilson, Arkansas, is a museum dedicated to the Modena site over there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a couple mound sites. Tennessee, we have Pinson, which is a huge woodland site, and the mound there is one of the largest in North America. We also have a site at Shallow National Military Park, a couple mound site, and there's another one downriver in Savannah, Tennessee, at the Cherry Mansion. And so there's just lots and lots of archaeological sites in Tennessee that you can go see. These are all publicly owned sites.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. And I'll have to check that out, like put a map together and maybe do like a few every weekend, or maybe one or two every weekend. That'd be awesome. And JoLynne, did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
Yeah, just to adding, because I was going to say the exact same thing, that there are a lot of places that you can visit to learn more about these people. And on top of being museums where they have artifacts, they have great walking trails. So
I'm a sucker for a good hike, so definitely.
And see some nature with social distancing and just have fun while you're doing it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you, Ron and JoLynne, so much for coming tonight and talking to us about Archaeology of West Tennessee, some fascinating things. And for everybody who's tuning in, be sure to check out the exhibition that's here with Ron's amazing collection, as well as Chucalissa's that our amazing curatorial intern, JoLynne Minnick put together. So, and yeah, so thank you so much, guys, and we hope everybody has a great night.
Well, thanks for pulling it together. And JoLynne, thank you for doing such a good job on the interpretation.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Awesome, awesome. Well, y'all take care and have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.